right, let's dive deep into a topic that's been sparking debate and legal battles for over a century. Adultery law in India. Specifically, we're looking at a 2018 Supreme Court case, Joseph Shine v. Union of India.
Yeah.
This case is really a fascinating journey.
Yeah.
And it unveils a lot about how society views marriage and women, especially women's agency and individual rights.
It is fascinating, isn't it? And the sources we're using really show how much the historical context, even changing social values, played a part in the legal arguments and, of course, the final outcome.
To think that just up until 2018, adultery was a crime in India, it's kind of mind-blowing. This law, Section 497 of the Indian Penal Code, it came about in the 19th century during British rule.
It's really important to keep that in mind, that the law didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was hugely influenced by British common law. Right. Specifically, the doctrine of coverture. This basically said a woman's legal identity was, well, an extension of her husband's.
Wow.
She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even represent herself in legal matters.
Like stepping back in time, isn't it?
It is, and that concept really shaped how adultery was viewed and punished.
And when you look closely at the language of Section 497, the bias is even more obvious. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So Section 497 had this built-in bias. Only the man in the adulterous relationship could be prosecuted, the woman, completely left out. Almost like she had no say in the matter at all.
So even if the woman started the affair, she wasn't held responsible legally. That seems so unjust.
Exactly. It gets even more, perplexing when you look at the clause about the husband's consent or connivance. Basically, the law said if the husband knew and allowed it to happen, the man couldn't be prosecuted.
Wait, so a husband could give another man permission to have a relationship with his wife? That's bizarre.
Yeah, it highlights the core problem the law treated women as possessions. It denied them agency, in these situations. Very different from how many other countries dealt with adultery. Many just decriminalized it altogether.
It's interesting that even Lord Macaulay, who helped write the Indian Penal Code, had reservations about making adultery a crime. Didn't he initially want financial compensation instead? I'm curious why that approach.
Yes. Macaulay thought adultery was a private matter, something to be settled between people, maybe through financial settlements. He felt making it criminal was too much, an overreach of the law. But his view didn't win out, and the law ended up reflecting the patriarchal values of the time.
Amazing that this law lasted over 150 years before being challenged in the Joseph Shine case. Can you walk us through how that case happened and the arguments used to challenge Section 497?
Certainly. Over time, Section 497 was challenged legally, but the Joseph Shine case was the one that really brought it all to a head. Joseph Shine, the petitioner, argued that the law violated Articles 14 and 21 of the Indian Constitution. Article 14, that's equality before the law. And Article 21, the right to life, personal liberty, including things like privacy and dignity.
Those judges' rulings were powerful. They really didn't hold back on criticizing Section 497, did they?
Nope. One judge said the law treats the woman as a chattel, like property. Another highlighted how the law kept a gender-biased approach and that it subverts true equality. These were huge statements coming from the highest court.
No wonder they ruled in favor of Joseph Shine and struck down Section 497. A big win for gender equality and individual rights in India.
Absolutely. The ruling made it clear. The law was unconstitutional. Adultery wouldn't be a crime in India anymore.
That must have started a lot of debate, right? Adultery is such a complicated issue. It touches on morality, social norms, personal choices.
You're right. Even though the law is gone, people in India are still discussing the effects of adultery legally and socially. Some think it should be a civil offense, something for divorce proceedings, while others say it's just personal and shouldn't involve any law at all.
That raises a fascinating question. Where does India fit in with the rest of the world and their adultery laws?
It's mixed, really. Lots of countries, especially in the West, have decriminalized adultery. The focus there is on marriage as a civil contract, not a moral institution that criminal law should control. But plenty of other countries, often ones with strong religious or conservative social structures, still see adultery as a crime. And some even have harsh penalties like jail time.
What a contrast. It shows how cultural norms have a huge influence on legal systems around the world.
Definitely. And it reminds us that what we consider justice can be very different depending on culture and history. What's a serious crime in one place could be a private matter somewhere else.
It's fascinating to see how societies deal with such a complex issue, charged with so much emotion. Makes you wonder if there'll ever be a global agreement on adultery laws, or will those cultural differences always be the deciding factor?
It's tough to say. Globalization might bring us closer on some things, but deep-rooted cultural and religious beliefs will probably always affect how societies handle things like adultery. Now, before we get into specific cases, I think it's important to understand the arguments for and against criminalizing adultery. Let's explore that debate next.
We've been talking about the history of this adultery law in India, how British common law shaped it, and that big ruling that finally decriminalized it. But what I'm really curious about is how did this law actually work in real life?
Right.
The sources mentioned some specific cases, and I think looking at those would give us a better, more, real-world understanding of how complex this all was.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one thing to talk about laws, but seeing how they affect people is really important to understand what they really mean.
Right.
One case that's highlighted shows just how imbalanced the power was because of Section 497. It was about a husband who used this law even though his wife had left him. They weren't even living together anymore.
So even though the marriage was basically over, he could still use this law to, punish the man his wife was with? That seems really unfair.
Exactly. The law didn't care that the marriage had fallen apart or that the wife had moved on. All it focused on was the husband's, his supposed right to go after someone. It really shows how patriarchal that view of marriage was, putting the husband in control.
It's like the woman's feelings and choices didn't matter at all to the law.
Sadly, that was often the case. The wife was seen as an extension of the husband's property, not a person with her own rights and freedom to make choices.
What happened in that case? Did the man actually get in trouble with the law?
Actually, no. The case was thrown out. The court saw that the situation was complicated and realized the husband was probably just using the law to harass his wife, who he was separated from.
Well, at least that's one small win. But it's disturbing to think how many people might have been treated unfairly or punished under this law before it was changed. Makes you wonder about a system that allows that kind of injustice to happen.
It does show how important it is to have laws that are fair and reflect the values of society as they change. Getting rid of that adultery law in India was a long time coming, and it's a big step towards seeing women as equals in marriage and in society.
That brings up another question. Now that adultery isn't a crime anymore in India, what happens legally? Is it just ignored completely?
Not really. While it's not a criminal offense, adultery can still be a civil wrong, so it can be used in divorce cases under certain conditions.
So it went from criminal law to family law.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I mean, adultery can really hurt a marriage, even if it's not a crime.
Exactly. The legal system still needs ways to deal with the fallout from adultery, like when a marriage ends. Decriminalizing it doesn't erase the pain or broken trust that comes with infidelity.
This makes me think about what's happening globally. We're talking about India, but what about other countries? How do they handle these adultery laws?
It's all over the place, really. Societies change, their values change, and the laws change too. A lot of Western countries, especially in Europe, got rid of adultery as a crime a long time ago. They see marriage as a civil contract, not something that criminal law should dictate morally.
So the focus is more on individual freedom and the right to make your own choices about relationships without worrying about getting in trouble with the law.
That's right. But then you have other countries, often with strong religious or conservative values, that still consider adultery a crime. And some have some really harsh punishments. I mean, we're talking imprisonment or even corporal punishment in some places.
That's such a different approach. It really highlights how cultural norms impact legal systems worldwide.
For sure. It reminds us that what one culture sees as justice might be totally different in another, based on their history and culture. What might land you in jail in one country could be seen as a personal choice somewhere else.
It's fascinating how different societies deal with adultery. Such a complex issue filled with emotion. Makes you wonder if we'll ever see a more unified approach globally, or if those cultural differences will always be the deciding factor.
Tough question. Globalization might lead to some agreement on certain issues, but deeply held cultural and religious beliefs will likely always be a part of how societies deal with things like adultery. Now, before we jump into those arguments for and against making adultery a crime, let's look at how it's handled legally in other situations. For example, can it come up in custody battles or when dividing assets during divorce?
Yeah, that's a good point. Even though it's not a crime in India anymore, adultery can still have legal consequences, especially when it comes to divorce.
Absolutely. And different countries have different systems. And even within a country, laws can vary from state to state, region to region.
So even if you're not going to jail for adultery, it can still have a big impact legally in certain situations.
Exactly. It's important to know the specific laws where you live and how they might apply to your own situation.
Good reminder. that legal stuff is rarely simple. There's always more to consider. But for now, let's move to that debate about whether adultery should be a crime. I think hearing both sides will give us a fuller understanding of this complicated issue. So, what are the main arguments for keeping adultery as a criminal offense? So we've covered a lot in this deep dive. The history of adultery law in India, how it changed, and what it means for society now that it's decriminalized. But before we finish up, we really should look at the arguments for and against making adultery a crime in the first place. It gets to the heart of what law is supposed to do, what marriage means, and that tricky balance between what society thinks is right and individual freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. To really get a good grasp of this issue, you have to see both sides. So why don't we start with why some people think adultery should still be illegal even today?
Okay, let's play devil's advocate for a bit. What are the main reasons people give for keeping adultery as a crime?
Well, one of the biggest arguments is that it protects the sanctity of marriage. The idea is having a law against it sends a strong message. Cheating on your spouse is a serious offense, not just some personal mistake. It reinforces the whole idea of a marriage contract, making it clear that breaking your vows has big consequences.
So it's about preserving the institution of marriage and keeping things stable in society. But wouldn't that mean the law is basically enforcing a specific set of morals?
Exactly. People who support this view often say that if you decriminalize adultery, it weakens marriage, maybe leading to more breakups and instability. They might even say it encourages cheating because people aren't so afraid of legal trouble.
Interesting point. But it also makes you wonder, should the government be telling us what's morally right or wrong? What about the arguments against making it a crime? What do people who think it should be a personal choice say?
Those who are against adultery laws usually talk about personal freedom and the right to make your own choices. They say adults should be able to decide what they do in their relationships without the government getting involved, especially when it's something so personal. They think the law should focus on preventing harm, not judging people's morals.
Sounds like they're saying there's a difference between what's morally wrong and what should be a crime. Just because society thinks something is bad doesn't automatically mean it should be illegal.
Right. And people who criticize these laws also point out they don't really work to stop infidelity. If someone's going to cheat, they'll probably do it anyway, whether there's a law or not.
Yeah, that makes sense. If someone's unhappy in their marriage or attracted to someone else, a law isn't going to change that. Might even make them hide it more, making it harder to deal with in the relationship.
Exactly. And then there's the practical side. How do you prove adultery in court? It can get really messy and invasive, needing evidence that's hard to find. Plus, it can be used in unfair ways, like we saw in those cases where husbands use the law to control or harass their wives.
All good points. Concerns about fairness, potential for abuse, and how difficult it is to prove adultery are common arguments for decriminalization. Critics say those laws, especially the ones biased against women, can be used as weapons in a marriage, causing more harm than good.
You've got it. It's a complicated debate with strong points on both sides. There's no simple answer. Each society has to figure out how to handle this tough issue. Cultural values, legal traditions, changing social norms, all these things affect how we view and deal with adultery.
Well, listener, we've really gone deep today. We've explored adultery law in India, from its history and complexities to the impact of decriminalization. We've seen how the law reflected and shaped what society believed, and how changing values led to legal reforms.
We've dug up some history, untangled legal jargon, and even touched on the big ideas behind this age-old dilemma. It's a conversation that goes beyond the courtroom, into our relationships, communities, and how we understand personal freedom and responsibility.
And even though this deep dive is giving you a good understanding of this topic, there's always more to learn. Check out the full Supreme Court judgment in the Joseph Schein case. Look into how adultery laws work around the world, and keep thinking about how love, commitment, and personal choices are changing in our world. The best learning comes from not just hearing information, but really thinking about it, questioning what you thought you knew, and looking for different points of view.
So keep diving deep, keep asking those questions, and keep those brains working.
And until next time, stay curious and keep exploring this amazing, complicated world we live in.